Welcome to Pseudobiblia. Today, Pseudobiblia presents The Strange Case of the March Burr, an unpublished Sherlock Holmes tale, Part 3, a novel written by Atanasio Pernati. Enjoy listening. There was a long, heavy silence. Fassbender drew a trembling breath, the sobs having subsided, leaving room for a sort of exhausted resignation. Then, with a broken voice, barely a whisper, he began to speak. The jimsonweed, he murmured, using with a thread of nostalgia the American popular name for stramonium, a name that evoked distant memories. It was the first plant whose effects I studied thoroughly since I was a boy, almost an adolescent, in my native Virginia, among my father's tobacco plantations. I was a solitary youth, devoured by an early and almost morbid passion for the natural sciences, fascinated by the secrets that nature concealed in its most humble and often most dangerous forms. Then I had the fortune, or perhaps, with hindsight, the terrible misfortune, to meet some elders of a Cherokee tribe, guardians of ancient wisdom. From them I learned not only the names and traditional uses of many sacred and medicinal plants, but also how to unleash their hidden potential, how to amplify their visionary effects, how to guide, or attempt to guide, the ecstatic and sometimes terrifying experiences they could induce. A shadow of ancient pride, a fleeting flash of the scientific passion that must once have animated him, crossed his devastated face for an instant, only to extinguish immediately, leaving only a deep, incurable regret. Then, naturally, continued Fassbender, his voice acquiring a strange, almost feverish intensity in recalling the past. Proceeding in my academic studies, first in America and then here in Europe, I dedicated myself to more exotic plant species, to rare fungi from impenetrable jungles, to more complex chemical compounds, and in my opinion, more refined ones. I sought the key to understanding the most intimate mechanisms of consciousness, to unveiling the secrets of perception. But I never lost sight of a fundamental truth, a truth that you, Mr. Holmes, with your profound knowledge of tobacco and its effects, will certainly understand. Some of the most powerful substances, capable of solving great problems or creating equally great ones, are often found in the most common plants, those we trample every day without deigning them a glance. Think of digitalis, so precious for a weary heart and so inexorably lethal if used unskillfully. Or belladonna, capable of dilating pupils for beauty, but also of darkening the mind forever. He lowered his gaze again, his voice becoming more uncertain, almost a whisper laden with pain. But the real reason, Mr. Holmes, the ultimate reason why in recent, desperate years I have returned with such obsessive dedication to studying stramonium, to rediscovering its most hidden and powerful virtues, is that I miss her. I miss her terribly every single instant of every single day, my dear, adored wife, Victoria. His voice broke on that name, and I saw his eyes, behind the thick lenses, moisten with barely contained tears. She disappeared 5 years ago, taken away by a cruel and incurable illness, a cancer that consumed her slowly, inexorably, before my helpless eyes. And when I say incurable, Mr. Holmes, and hear his voice cracked in a stifled sob, I mean literally, desperately incurable. I tried everything, consulted the best specialists in Europe and America, spent sleepless nights scouring entire libraries, forgotten archives of ancient herbals in desperate search of a substance, of an ancient remedy or a new, revolutionary discovery that could even just improve her painful situation, which instead was irreparably compromised, day after day, taking her away from me piece by piece. A sincere sob, weeping of pure, inconsolable desperation shook him to his foundations, and for a moment I feared he would not be able to continue. I had to look away, deeply disturbed by that pain so naked, so palpable, that transcended any judgment of his guilt. In the end, resumed Fassbender after a long, painful moment, awkwardly wiping his eyes with the back of his thin and stained hand, only my daughter and I remained, my little Jane. And that was the moment, the darkest, emptiest moment of my existence, when I thought, I hoped with all my strength, to be able to see my Victoria once more, to be able to hear her voice again, her comfort. He raised his gaze, and in his eyes now shone a strange light, almost feverish, the expression of a man who has found a handhold on the edge of a precipice. With the right dose, Mr. Holmes, a dose carefully, scientifically calculated in relation to body weight, physical constitution, and individual sensitivity of the subject, stramonium, my old, faithful jimsonweed, can make one experience. Transcendent experiences. It can make one see again, speak to, almost touch the dear people who are no longer with us. I myself am living proof, the first astonished witness. An ecstatic smile, almost disturbing in its intensity, illuminated his emaciated face for an instant. My life has changed since then, Mr. Holmes. My relationship with my daughter Jane, which had closed in a cocoon of pain and incomprehension, has blossomed again. Everything has changed since I see again, several times a week, in the sanctity of my study, my Victoria. And it has certainly changed for the better. The pain has not vanished, but it has become bearable, shared. There was a silence, charged with bewilderment, in the small room. The man seemed to speak with disarming sincerity, with a conviction that bordered on mystical delirium. So, continued Fassbender, and in his voice now there was a sort of naive, almost childlike conviction, as if he were expounding the most logical and charitable of enterprises. I thought, why not offer others the same incredible relief that I myself feel? Why not help them alleviate their daily cares, the unbearable weight of mourning, the emptiness of loss? Why not share this gift? He seemed sincerely, deeply convinced of the goodness, almost the sanctity, of his mission. I asked for help from my faithful assistant and student, Roger, the one you knew under the false guise of the butler. He has an incredible eye, a natural talent, and a steady hand in dosing extracts, in calibrating preparations based on the weight, age, and presumed sensitivity of each participant. I personally chose, with meticulous care, the best actors that my finances, initially rather scarce, could afford, so that they would interpret their parts with due perfection, with the necessary emotional charge. I made sure that, despite the ups and downs of their unfortunate careers and the difficulties of their lives, they maintained a certain inner dignity, and that somehow they believed, or at least respected, such an ambitious project so beneficial for suffering humanity. A bitter smile, almost of commiseration for the baseness of the world, creased his thin lips. For the extras of the Shadow Theatre, my skilled Oriental artists, it was, I admit, a bit more difficult. Getting them fully into my mentality, convincing them of the spiritual and therapeutic importance of their contribution. Well, I must say that in trusting to them, masters of such an ancient and noble art, tasks they considered of lower profile, like interpreting some anonymous wandering soul in the background, at most some minor demon with harmless fake papier-mâché horns to represent the temptations and trials of the spiritual journey, or even, which offended them deeply, making them push back and forth in the darkness. The wheeled chairs of participants from the séance hall to the Swedenborg rooms through the corridors. They found it quite degrading to their art and dignity. I had to bargain quite a bit, and promised them a considerably higher percentage of the proceeds compared to the other actors, to have them steadily and faithfully in my team. Professor Fassbender's confession, so raw in its madness and so tragic in its origin, fell upon the small room like a shroud, leaving all three of us, myself, Holmes and Inspector Gregson, in a silence charged with bewilderment and a strange, oppressive sadness. The man had concluded his delirious tale with an almost supplicating air, his feverish eyes seeking in our faces not so much forgiveness, which he knew impossible, as a sort of impossible understanding for his distorted mission. For a long, painful moment, in the laboratory pervaded by the acrid smell of his preparations and the cold light of dawn that now revealed it in all its squalid reality, absolute silence reigned, broken only by the professor's labored breathing and the distant murmur of the city awakening. Inspector Gregson was the first to shake his head, an expression of astonishment and harsh police disapproval hardening his features. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to pronounce one of his typical, curt condemnations, but Holmes forestalled him with a slight, almost imperceptible gesture of his hand. "My friend," observed Fassbender, with an expression I had rarely seen painted on his face. Certainly, there was a trace of that cold, analytical distance with which he was accustomed to examining the most astute and complex criminals, but there was also distinctly readable in it something. Taken aback, a sort of embarrassed discomfort in the face of such a deep abyss of self-deception, so rooted in pain. It seemed that the professor's words, with their disarming and delirious conviction of acting for the good of others, had touched an unexpected chord, a sensitive point in his armor of logic and rationality. "Professor Fassbender," began Holmes, and his voice, when he spoke, was strangely calm, almost devoid of his usual inquisitorial bite, as if addressing more a gravely ill patient than a cold calculator. "Your personal tragedy, the loss of your beloved wife, is evident, and my heart, believe me, is not insensitive to your pain. I understand, or at least try to understand, how such profound suffering can lead the human mind down tortuous and desperate paths, in spasmodic search of a comfort that the cold reality of facts seems inexorably to deny." He paused, choosing his words carefully, as if fearing to break an already so precarious balance. "However, Professor, you speak with fervor of relief, of alleviating daily cares, as if yours had been a philanthropic work, a humanitarian mission. But I wonder, with all the seriousness the circumstance demands, whether you are fully, consciously aware of the true nature of the visions you have so diligently and scientifically orchestrated for your victims." Holmes slowly approached the work table, touching with his fingertips a glass alembic still warm. "You have induced, with the reckless use of extremely powerful and dangerous plant substances, states of profound hallucination, of dissociation from reality, in individuals already rendered particularly vulnerable by mourning, emotional fragility, and hope that bordered on desperation. You have manipulated their most sacred and intimate memories, projecting actors and Chinese shadows to impersonate their deceased, to relive moments and words that belonged only to the sanctuary of their memory. Do you really believe, Professor, that this can be called relief? Or is it not rather a cruel and sophisticated deception, a profanation of memory and mourning that offers comfort as ephemeral as it is illusory, at the price of a potential psychological dependence on these false consolations, and even more seriously, of concrete and not negligible damage to the physical and mental health of your patients?" Fassbender's ashen face contracted in a grimace of pain or perhaps incomprehension. But they were happy, Mr. Holmes," he stammered, with a thread of voice. "I saw them smile again, cry tears of joy, not desperation. Like you, Dr. Watson," he said, suddenly addressing me, and in his inflamed eyes, behind the thick lenses, I read a shadow of desperate, almost childlike hope for approval. "You saw your daughter, your little Lucy, didn't you? You were happy to see her again, weren't you?" Before I could answer, still deeply shaken by the memory of that vision so vivid and so heartbreaking, and confused by the implications of his words, Holmes intervened with a firmness that admitted no replies, though devoid of harshness. "Happiness induced by poison, Professor," said Holmes, with a grave but implacable voice, "is itself a poison, perhaps the most insidious of all. You have created, with undoubted scientific and theatrical mastery, a circus of optical and chemical illusions, a phantasmagorical park of the soul, populated by paid ghosts and experts in the art of visual lies. You have transformed the most intimate and sacred pain, mourning, into a sideshow for the credulous, however sophisticated and well orchestrated. And in all this, Professor Fassbender, believe me, there is nothing beneficial, nothing compassionate. Only a cynical, though perhaps initially unconscious, exploitation of human fragility and desperation, masked in your own eyes by your personal, and I fear profoundly distorted, form of grief therapy." Holmes slowly moved away from the work table, his gaze returning to that of the implacable detective, no longer that of the man almost embarrassed in the face of the naked confession of a tormented soul. "You believe, or perhaps have wanted to believe, that you have committed a victimless crime, Professor Fassbender, because in your mind you offered an illusion of happiness, a balm for the wounds of the soul. But there are victims, I assure you, and they are numerous. They are all those people we left sleeping on the landing, and all those who passed through here before them, who now must come to terms not only with their original pain, but also with the bitterness and shame of having been deceived in the most vile and cruel way. And there are also your actors, your extras, people often desperate or weak, whom you have involved in a dishonorable and criminal enterprise. And there is, not least, yourself, Professor, victim of your own deception, prisoner of a phantom that you yourself evoked with chemistry instead of with the strength of spirit, and which I now fear will haunt you for the rest of your days. Holmes's words, though spoken in a measured tone, almost devoid of emphasis, fell upon the room with the weight of an unappealable condemnation, of a truth that could no longer be denied. Fassbender did not reply, limiting himself to bowing his head ever more deeply on his chest. Every trace of his previous, delirious confidence or his hope for understanding completely vanished. He was a destroyed, annihilated man. Chapter 14. A thread of hope in the darkness. A long, heavy silence followed Holmes's words. It was broken only by the subdued and almost disrespectful noise of Gregson's agents, who, with discretion but efficiency, continued to inspect and catalogue the instruments and substances present in the laboratory, now effectively a crime scene. Holmes then addressed Inspector Gregson. His tone returned practical, concise, that of the investigative consultant who has concluded his work. Inspector, have your men tracked down and stopped all the artists of the Shadow Theatre? Gregson nodded, consulting a small notebook he had extracted from his pocket. Yes, Mr. Holmes. The others were hidden in a small and squalid storeroom located behind the Black Room, probably their operational base for maneuvering the strings and lights. They attempted a brief and disorganized resistance, dictated more by fright than by real bellicose intention, but they were all promptly stopped by my men. They don't speak a word of English, or pretend very well not to speak it. An interpreter will be necessary. Predictable, commented Holmes with a nod. They will be simple executors, probably unaware of the real criminal scope of the enterprise they were involved in, or perhaps forced by circumstances and necessity. Their fate, in any case, will be decided by the competent authorities once their individual responsibilities are ascertained. Then his gaze rested again, with strange intensity, on Douglas Fassbender, who sat slumped and motionless on a laboratory stool, the very image of defeat and desperation. As for our director and principal architect of this complex and poisonous illusion, I believe his role and responsibilities in this sad affair are now abundantly and unequivocally clear. Inspector, I believe you may proceed as your duty requires. Gregson made a sharp nod to two of his most robust agents, who approached with decisive steps toward Fassbender. The man offered no resistance, did not even raise his gaze, while the cold metal handcuffs were tightened around his thin wrists, stained with chemical reagents. The tinkle of chains resounded sinister and final in the small laboratory, marking the end of his career as a scientist and the beginning of a long, and I fear painful, path of expiation. As they led him away, and he crossed with shuffling steps the threshold of the laboratory to be escorted out of the apartment, through those corridors and rooms that had been the theater of his deceptions, Professor Fassbender raised his gaze for one last time. His eyes, behind the thick lenses, met Holmes's for an instant. There was still in them a trace of that mute, desperate questioning I had noticed before, but for a fleeting, almost imperceptible moment, a shadow of something else, something that resembled a strange, melancholic, and inexplicable happiness, or perhaps a residual, desperate hope, crossed his ashen face. Then desperation and shame returned to veil his features as he was led along the corridor, disappearing from our sight. I noticed that strange, fleeting change of expression, but the fatigue of the long night, the confusion of events and horror at the discoveries made me set it aside as a further, negligible oddity of an affair already full of inexplicable and disturbing elements. Holmes, who never missed a single detail, however apparently insignificant, noticed it, and an imperceptible tremor contracted his lips, as if that small, anomalous sign had confirmed a suspicion or opened a new, disturbing line of inquiry. At that moment, Gregson addressed one of his men. "Agent Miller, go check on the 3 guests we left on the landing. With the fresh air coming in and the commotion, they might start to wake up. Make sure they're well, and inform them that they'll soon be accompanied to the station for a formal deposition." Just as the agent was leaving, we heard confused noises coming from outside the apartment. When we went out, following Holmes, who headed with decisive steps toward the main exit, we found that, as expected, Lady Vance, Sir Geoffrey and Mrs. Pemberton had awakened from their induced sleep. They were sitting on the makeshift beds, assisted by a couple of policemen, and their expressions were a mixture of confusion, bewilderment, and the after-effects of a far from pleasant awakening. Their faces were pale, eyes still clouded, and they looked around as if struggling to understand where they were and what had really happened. Sir Geoffrey, the bearded nobleman, was the first to recognize us. An expression of immense relief crossed his drawn face. "Gentlemen," he exclaimed, his voice still thick, so it was all a deception, those spirits, those visions." "I'm afraid so, Sir Geoffrey," replied Holmes, with a note of gravity. "A very elaborate deception, but still a deception. You were victims of a cruel fraud, orchestrated with the aid of chemical substances and skilled actors." The man passed a trembling hand over his forehead. "My God, I feel like a fool, yet it seemed so real." Then a shadow of gratitude replaced the confusion. "But I thank you from the bottom of my heart." Mrs. Pemberton, the industrialist's widow too, though still visibly shaken, and with a rather indignant air at having been deceived so blatantly, expressed similar relief. "Those scoundrels," she muttered, adjusting her shawl with uncertain fingers, "making a poor widow believe she could speak with her deceased husband. It's a shameful thing. I hope they rot in prison. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. And thank you too, Inspector," she added, with a nod to Gregson. "At least now we know the truth, however bitter." They were both relieved, almost incredulous at having escaped such a deception, and their gratitude, though expressed in different ways, was palpable. Lady Eleanor Vance, however, was an image of composed but profound disappointment. She had stood up and stared at us with an expression that broke my heart. Her face was pale as marble, and in her clear eyes, usually so bright, one could read a deep bitterness, almost a betrayal. Her faith in communications with her deceased husband, a man so deeply connected to the ideals of the Theosophical Society, a faith that had given her comfort for months, had been brutally, irreparably shattered. It was not anger at the deception suffered that dominated her, but pain for lost hope. "So, it was all false, Lord Wayne?" she asked, her voice barely audible whisper, her gaze fixed on Holmes, completely ignoring my presence. "Even your research, your interest in spiritual phenomena." Holmes looked at her with a rare expression of sincere regret. "Lady Vance," he said, and his tone was devoid of any trace of the alias he had used, "my interest in truth is always genuine. And sometimes, unfortunately, the truth is that there are people capable of speculating on others' pain and hope in the most cynical way. I understand your disappointment, and believe me, I am deeply saddened by it. Your husband was a man of worth, and his memory deserves respect, not this vulgar theatrics." Lady Vance did not respond. She lowered her gaze, and I saw a solitary tear slowly descend her cheek. She turned, and without adding a word, accepted the arm that an agent offered to help her down the stairs. Her silence was more eloquent than any reproach. Holmes returned to the atrium. His gaze was thoughtful, almost troubled, and instead of showing the usual satisfaction for a brilliantly solved case, he seemed absorbed in a deeper, almost philosophical reflection. He stopped in front of the door of the small kitchen where we had previously found and arrested Roger, the butler chemist. "Watson," began Holmes, his voice more subdued than usual, almost as if he were speaking more to himself than to me or Gregson, who had followed us curiously. "This night, this entire tragic affair has led me down paths of reflection that I have rarely traveled with such urgency." He passed a hand over his forehead, a gesture of unusual fatigue or perhaps deep introspection. "Throughout my career, as you well know, I have placed logic, observation, and scientific deduction above every other human faculty. I have always believed that every mystery, however complex, could be unraveled, every deception unmasked, every truth brought to light through rigorous application of the analytical method. He paused, his gaze seeming to lose itself in an imprecise point beyond the kitchen wall. Yet, he continued, faced with the desperate pain of a man like Fassbender, faced with his lucid madness and his distorted, but in its way almost touching, search for impossible comfort. And faced, my dear friend, with your own, so intense and viscerally real, experience in the so-called room of Swedenborg, I find myself questioning the limits of my own art. He turned toward me, and in his gray eyes, usually so cold and sharp, I read a shadow of something I had never seen before. A deep doubt and almost touching vulnerability. As you well know from your medical profession, Watson, and as I myself have learned from my more recent studies on the mechanisms of the mind, especially those of that brilliant French scholar, Pierre Janet, there exist emotional traumas, wounds of the soul, that can become deeply embedded in the human psyche. Janet postulates that such experiences, if not promptly addressed and resolved with understanding and, I would dare say, with a form of catharsis, can drag on for years, generating suffering, dissociations, and even the creation of alternative realities in which the mind seeks refuge from unbearable pain. Holmes approached the wall cupboard in the kitchen, the one whose door he had opened and closed so fleetingly before. His gaze became intense. "Sometimes, Watson," he said, with a voice charged with strange gravity, "the most difficult truth to discover is not that hidden behind a criminal deception, but that concealed in the deepest and most painful folds of the human heart. And sometimes, to bring it to light, or to offer it a possibility of healing, the cold logic of the detective is not enough. It requires a different approach." He stopped in front of the tall and narrow cupboard door. That fleeting smile on Fassbender's face while he was being arrested, Watson, it was not triumph nor resignation, it was hope. The hope that we, too busy unmasking his laboratory and his accomplices, had overlooked something, or rather someone, who was more precious to him than anything else. He turned toward me, and in his eyes I read a mute request, an invitation to perform one last, perhaps the most important, act of that long night. "Watson," he said, with a gentleness that tugged at my heart, "please do me the courtesy. Open that door." A new sense of expectation, an indefinable presentiment mixed with growing apprehension, took hold of me. What could possibly be hidden behind that simple door of a kitchen cupboard to justify such solemnity and such psychological preparation on my friend's part? I remembered his fleeting glance inside, earlier, an expression I had not been able to decipher, but which now, retrospectively, assumed the contours of a discovery already made, of a truth he had chosen not to reveal immediately. With my heart beating a little faster than usual, I approached the tall and narrow wall cupboard. The white paint was chipped in several places, and the door seemed old and unsteady. I grasped the small, blackened brass handle. I pulled. The door opened with a plaintive creak, almost a sigh, revealing not dusty shelves or forgotten brooms as I would have expected, but a cramped space, dark as the mouth of a well, an oppressive cubicle that seemed almost carved by force into the structure of the wall. And there, huddled in a corner, sitting on a small and uncomfortable stool of rough wood, her head hidden between thin knees and slender arms wrapped around her legs in a desperate gesture of self-protection, was a child. She could not have been more than 7 or 8 years old, perhaps even less. She was incredibly pale and thin, her fair hair, long and disheveled, fell over her gaunt face, partially hiding her features. The large blue eyes, which I glimpsed for an instant before she huddled even more, were wide with terror and circled by livid and deep shadows that spoke of infinite weariness and prolonged fear that no creature so young should ever have known. She wore a simple dress, of light fabric, wrinkled and stained, that seemed too large for her slender and fragile figure. She convulsively clutched to her chest a small rag doll, worn and missing an eye, as if it were the only anchor in a world that had collapsed upon her. When the sunlight struck her full in the face, the child recoiled like a frightened wild animal, emitting a small, imperceptible moan. and instinctively brought her hands before her eyes to protect herself from what, to her, must have seemed a further, intolerable aggression. I recognized, with a heart-stopping shock that froze the blood in my veins and a wave of bewilderment, of incredulous and heartbreaking pity that almost took my breath away, the delicate and suffering features of the girl who, only a few hours before, in my stramonium-induced vision, I had wept for and embraced as my little, adored Lucy. But this was not an ethereal and smiling creature dressed in white and surrounded by celestial light. This was a real child, flesh and blood, terrified, desperate, but undeniably, tragically true. "My God, Holmes," I whispered, my voice broken with emotion, turning toward my friend who observed the scene from the kitchen threshold, his face inscrutable, but his eyes shining with a strange, intense light, a mixture of sadness and deep, almost painful, understanding. The child, hearing my voice, perhaps recognizing in it a tone of unexpected gentleness, or perhaps simply by the instinct that sometimes guides the most frightened creatures toward a possible source of salvation, slowly lowered her hands from her face. Her frightened eyes, large and luminous despite the fear and weariness that clouded them, fixed on mine. And then, at that precise instant, something extraordinary, almost inexplicable happened. The fear on her face did not entirely vanish, but seemed for a moment to attenuate, almost suspend, replaced by an expression of timid surprise, and then, almost imperceptibly, by a shadow of uncertain, childish, but unmistakable relief. A relief entirely incongruous and surprising, given the dramatic situation she found herself in, and given that I was, to her, a complete stranger. "You," she murmured with a thread of voice, barely audible, a whisper that seemed like that of a frightened little bird fallen from its nest. "You are the kind gentleman." Her childish eyes, still full of unshed tears, fixed on mine with an intensity that pierced my soul. I was speechless, completely taken aback by that question, trying to control my own growing emotion and kneeling slowly before the cupboard opening to bring myself to her level. "Professor Fassbender is your father." The child nodded timidly, without stopping to stare at me with those large clear eyes, as if desperately seeking in me some form of reassurance, a safe harbor in that storm of terror and confusion. "Yes," she whispered, "I am Jane, his little girl, his only little girl." Jane, the daughter the professor had mentioned in his delirious and tragic confession. The same one who, in my hallucination, had worn the clothes and name of my never-had, but so intensely desired, Lucy. But what was such a small, fragile child doing, hidden there in that dark, cold and suffocating cubbyhole, like a small hunted animal? And why did she seem relieved, almost comforted, to see precisely me, a stranger who had, in fact, just contributed decisively to the arrest and ruin of her father, the only person left in the world to her? Sherlock Holmes, from the threshold, continued to observe the scene with attention that boded nothing good from a legal standpoint, but perhaps, who knows, with compassion and understanding that went beyond any of my previous experience of my friend. His different approach, the one that transcended simple investigative logic and delved into the dark and painful meanderings of the human heart, was about to reveal itself in all its unpredictable and deeply touching complexity. "Jane," I repeated gently, trying to infuse into my voice all the reassurance I was capable of. "I am Dr. Watson. Your father spoke to me about you. You don't have to be afraid now. No one will hurt you." Slowly, with hesitation that tugged at my heart, the child extended a small trembling hand out of her hiding place, almost seeking contact, tangible proof that my words were sincere. I took her hand gently. It was cold and thin like that of a little bird. "Father, they took him away, didn't they?" she asked with a thread of voice, her eyes filling with new tears, this time not of fear, but of infinite sadness, of an awareness that no child her age should have faced. I nodded sadly, unable to lie to her. "Yes, Jane, I'm afraid so, but that's why we're here, to understand and to help you." She lowered her gaze to the rag doll she clutched to her chest, caressing its frayed woolen hair. I acted for him," she confessed, with the disarming honesty of children, almost ashamed of it, as if revealing a mischief. "To make him happy, I was, I was the Lucy you saw last night, sir. And sometimes I was other children or little angels. Father told me what to say, how to move in the light. You did it for your father? I asked, trying to maintain a neutral tone, despite the bewilderment and pain those words awakened in me. Jane nodded vigorously, her dark hair falling over her eyes. Yes, ever since Mama Victoria went to heaven, Father was always so sad. He didn't smile anymore, didn't play with me anymore. He spent hours locked in his laboratory and sometimes cried at night when he thought I couldn't hear him. Her little voice cracked. Then, one day, he started seeing Mama again. He told me he had found a way to talk to her, to feel her close. And from that moment he changed. He started smiling again, telling me stories, being my father from before. She raised her eyes to me again, and I read in them a deep, desperate loyalty and filial love that went beyond any judgment. To me it always seemed like something a bit strange, you understand, talking to people who aren't there anymore, those rooms with lights and shadows. But Father is the smartest person in the world. He knows everything about plants and stars. And after Mama went away, he's the only person I have left in the world. The only one. I thought that if I helped him, if I did what he asked, he would stay happy. And if he was happy, then maybe he wouldn't go away too, to reach Mama in heaven. I was so afraid of being alone, sir, completely alone in this big, frightening city. Her words, spoken with heartbreaking innocence, were a punch to the stomach. That child was not an accomplice in the strict sense of the term. She was a victim, as much as the clients her father had deceived. A victim of her father's pain, his desperation, his madness, and a victim of her own desperate need for love and security, which had led her to go along with a cruel and dangerous game rather than lose the only fragile bond she had left. He told me that we brought relief to people, continued Jane, almost seeking confirmation, justification in my eyes, that we helped them not to be sad any more like he had been. And sometimes, when I saw their faces after the meetings, they really seemed more serene, they smiled through their tears. Maybe we really did do a little good, don't you think, sir? Her naivety, her desperate search for meaning, for a glimmer of positivity in that web of deceptions, was moving and terrible at the same time. I was looking for the right words to answer her, to offer her some, however inadequate, comfort without endorsing her father's lies, when Holmes, who had remained silent on the threshold, observing and listening with almost painful intensity, moved. He clasped his hands behind his back, a gesture habitual to him when deeply absorbed. Inspector Gregson, at his side, had an expression of bewilderment and awkward compassion I had rarely seen in him. It was clear that even the rough Scotland Yard man had been touched by the tragic innocence of that child. He took a step forward, entering the small and narrow kitchen. His tall figure seemed to fill the space, but there was nothing threatening in his bearing. On the contrary, his features, usually so sharp and analytical, appeared strangely softened, almost veiled by a sadness he did not try to hide. He knelt slowly before Jane, bringing his gaze to the level of the child's. A gesture so unusual for Holmes, so devoid of his customary professional distance, that it left me momentarily breathless. "Jane," he said, and his voice, when he spoke, was incredibly gentle, almost a whisper. "What you did for your father, you did for love, and with the heart of a child who was only trying to protect the only person she had left. No one here judges you for this." The child looked at him, her large clear eyes still moist with tears, but with a less frightened expression, almost curious about this strange and gentle man who spoke to her with such sweetness. "Your father," continued Holmes, choosing his words with extreme care, "suffered greatly, immensely, for the loss of your mother. And sometimes, when pain is too great, the human mind seeks refuge in ways that are not always wise or just for others. He believed, in his tormented heart, he was doing good, both for himself and for the people who came here. But the means he used, the substances he administered, were dangerous, Jane. And illusions, however comforting they may seem at first, in the long run cannot replace truth, nor heal the true wounds of the soul." He paused, letting his words, simple but profound, be absorbed by the childish but evidently intelligent mind of the girl. "Now, Jane," he resumed, with a tone that was both firm and reassuring, "your father will have to answer for his actions before the law. This is inevitable, and in a certain sense, it is also just. But you, my child, have no fault in this sad affair. You have been a victim as much as the others." He addressed Inspector Gregson, who had remained silent on the threshold, visibly moved by the scene. "Inspector," said Holmes, and in his tone there was a quiet but unappealable authority, "I believe Miss Fassbender has already suffered enough because of her father's reckless and criminal actions. I do not consider necessary nor appropriate restrictive measures regarding her. She is a frightened and alone child who needs care and protection, not a courtroom or a cold correctional institute." He raised a hand before Gregson could protest, anticipating the policeman's objections. "I understand the procedures, Inspector, and the necessity of testimony, but I am certain a way can be found to collect her statements in a more suitable environment and with due delicacy. For now, I believe the most important thing is to remove her from this place of sadness and deceptions." Holmes stood up, then addressed me again. "Watson, my dear friend, I believe this is a task more suited to your sensitivity and your profession than to mine or the inspector's. I entrust little Jane to you. Accompany her out of this hell, make sure she is given something warm to drink, and that she is treated with all the kindness and consideration that her young age and innocence require. I will immediately contact certain acquaintances of mine, people of heart and influence, who can provide adequate temporary accommodation for her, while the authorities decide what to do for her future, taking into account her condition as a de facto orphan and victim." Gregson, after a moment of hesitation, in which I saw the conflict between his duty as a policeman and his humanity as a man, nodded slowly, an expression of mute understanding on his face. "As you wish, Mr. Holmes," he said with a hoarse voice. "Dr. Watson, take care of the child. My men will give you all necessary assistance." I approached Jane, who looked at me with a mixture of fear and new, fragile hope. I extended my hand to her. "Come, Jane," I said in the gentlest voice I could find. "Let's leave this place. I promise everything will be all right." Her small hand, still cold, grasped mine trustingly. As I helped her up and guided her out of that dark cubicle, and then through the squalid rooms of the apartment that had been the theater of so many illusions, I felt her little body tremble slightly. But when we crossed the threshold and found ourselves in the corridor, and then on the stairs leading toward the uncertain light of morning and toward an unknown, but hopefully less dark future, Jane turned to me for one last time. "Doctor," she whispered, and in her clear eyes, despite everything, shone a small, timid smile, "will you write to me sometimes, so I don't feel so completely alone in the world?" "I promise you, Jane," I replied, my voice cracked with emotion. "I promise you with all my heart." And that small, fragile smile, born amid so much sadness and deception, was perhaps the truest and most touching ray of light of that long, incredible night. As I accompanied Jane toward a police carriage that Gregson had made available to us, leaving Holmes to supervise the final investigative details and the seizure of Fassbender's laboratory, I felt emptied, but also strangely serene. Justice was taking its course, the guilty would be punished, but amid so much darkness, a small, innocent flower had been brought to safety. And perhaps, I thought, in that gesture of unexpected compassion from my logical and rational friend, there was a deeper and more important truth than all the scientific deductions. Epilogue. Chapter 15. Reflections by Candlelight. Several weeks had passed since that memorable and shocking night in Fleet Street, and London, with its sovereign indifference to individual troubles, had resumed its usual rhythms, swallowing in its vast and pulsing organism that small, sordid tragedy. Spring, meanwhile, had finally decided to make its entrance, and milder evenings were beginning to invite long, reflective walks. One such evening, toward the end of April, I found myself as usual in our sitting room at 221 B. Baker Street. The fire in the fireplace had been replaced by a vase of fresh daffodils, whose delicate fragrance mingled with the more acrid and familiar one of tobacco from Holmes's pipe. My friend sat in his favorite armchair, violin resting on his knees, but he was not playing. He was unusually silent, his gaze lost in the imaginary embers of a fire that was not there, immersed in one of those deep abstractions that sometimes isolated him from the world for hours. I was seated at the table, intent on rereading a letter I had received that afternoon. It was from Jane Fassbender. She wrote from a small and quiet institute for young ladies in need of assistance, located in the Kent countryside, where, thanks to Holmes's discreet but surprisingly effective intervention with some of his influential and charitable acquaintances, she had been welcomed instead of ending up in the cold and unsuitable walls of a public orphanage, or worse, a reformatory. In her still childish but neat handwriting, Jane told of her timid progress in studies, the kindness of the lay sisters who ran the institute, and long walks in flowering fields. She concluded every missive, and this was no exception, thanking me for my letters and signing herself, "Your affectionate Jane." Every time, those words tugged at my heart with a mixture of sweetness and deep melancholy. The fate of the other protagonists of that sad affair had now been outlined in courtrooms. Professor Douglas Fassbender, faced with overwhelming evidence and perhaps driven by one last, desperate desire to protect his daughter from further involvement and trauma, had fully confessed his responsibility in organizing the complex fraud, taking upon himself much of the blame for the chemical and psychological manipulation of his victims. His profound knowledge of psychoactive substances and his delirious, obsessive desire to recreate a bond with his deceased wife, Victoria, had emerged with tragic clarity during the trial, painting the portrait of a man as brilliant as he was irreparably led astray by pain and science devoid of conscience. He had been sentenced to a long prison term, 8 years of imprisonment, which I was told by Gregson he had accepted with the same resigned and silent sadness we had seen in him at the moment of arrest, except for that fleeting flash of relief that had crossed his face when he learned that Jane had been entrusted to loving and safe care. Thanks to his undoubted medical and chemical competencies, he had been granted, after some time, to serve in the prison infirmary, an employment that, perhaps, represented for him a late and partial form of expiation. Ian Irons, the talented actor who had impersonated the charismatic Alastair Thorne, received a sentence of 2 years hard labor. His defense, based on economic desperation and manipulations suffered from Fassbender, had not fully convinced the jury, although his figure emerged as a professionally failed and personally destroyed man by vices. As for Josephine Finette Cork, the lively and reckless Lady Araminta, her fate was similar to Irons's. She too was sentenced to 2 years, but her case aroused a certain morbid interest in the scandal press. When details emerged about her Parisian past and her connections with circles of so-called cursed poets, there were rumors of evenings spent in the company of figures like Verlaine and other devotees of absinthe and opium, and her declared conviction that hallucinogenic substances were an instrument to expand the doors of perception and sharpen artistic sensitivity was reported with great emphasis, painting her more as a decadent adept of forbidden cults than as a simple swindler. She herself, during the trial, showed no particular remorse, maintaining almost with pride that she had participated in a bold experiment on the boundaries of reality, a position that certainly did not help her in the judge's eyes, but that consecrated her as a picturesque and controversial figure in the eyes of a certain public. The other actors in the company, minor and often indigent figures, had gotten away with pecuniary penalties or severe warnings, once their marginal role and almost total ignorance of the true nature of the substances employed was ascertained. As for the shadow theater experts, after a brief period of detention and laborious interrogations conducted with the aid of an interpreter, they had finally been repatriated to their distant country of origin, considered more exploited workers than true criminals. Roger Fassbender's faithful and skilled assistant, having partially collaborated with authorities once he understood the gravity of his position, pleaded to a 3-year sentence, fully admitting his crucial role in preparing and administering the substances. "It's strange, Holmes," I finally said, breaking the long and comfortable silence that had been created between us and placing Jane's letter on the table. "Despite all the harm he caused, I can't get Professor Fassbender out of my head. Thinking back to his words, his desperation, sometimes I wonder if, deep in his tormented heart, his intention wasn't, however irreparably distorted and criminal, almost compassionate. A mad and desperate attempt to alleviate pain, his own and that of others, with the only means his scientific and derailed mind had managed to conceive." Holmes slowly placed the violin on his knees. He remained silent for a moment, observing the spirals of smoke rising from his clay pipe and dispersing in the room's air. Then, with that typical manner of his of arriving at the deepest heart of questions with few, precise, and sometimes ruthless words, he answered. "Compassion, my dear Watson," he said, his voice calm but with an undertone of inflexible rigor, "when it is not firmly anchored to truth, when it is not guided by the deepest respect for the integrity and freedom of the individual, can itself become an instrument of profound and involuntary cruelty." Professor Fassbender, in his self-absolving delirium, confused chemical illusion with soul-cure psychological manipulation with fraternal aid. He acted like a doctor who, to temporarily alleviate a patient's pain, administers a poison that will lead him to an even more terrible dependence and certain ruin. He rose and slowly approached the window, looking out into the twilight of the London evening, where the first gas lamps were beginning to dot the incipient darkness with golden light. "Throughout my career, Watson," he continued, with a more reflective, almost confessional tone, "as you know all too well, I have clung with all my strength to a fundamental principle, to a pillar I believed unshakable, and which was expressed with unsurpassable clarity by that great and lucid intellect that was the Marquis Pierre Simon de Laplace. You will certainly remember his celebrated words, which I have often quoted to you. We must regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its previous state, and as the cause of the one which will follow. Given for one instant an intelligence which could comprehend all the forces by which nature is animated and the respective situation of the beings who compose it, an intelligence sufficiently vast to submit these data to analysis, it would embrace in the same formula the movements of the greatest bodies of the universe and those of the lightest atom. For it nothing would be uncertain, and the future, as the past, would be present to its eyes. This, Watson, has been for years my secular gospel, my unshakable creed, that every event, every human action, every thought, however apparently chaotic or irrational, is the inevitable result of antecedent causes and the certain cause of future effects, all concatenated in a chain of iron logic, perfectly accessible to a sufficiently analytical mind, furnished with adequate data." He turned toward me, and in the uncertain light coming from the street, I saw on his usually so impassive face an expression I had rarely, or perhaps never, glimpsed before, a shadow of doubt, of deep, almost painful reflection. "Well, Watson," he confessed, with a sincerity that surprised and moved me at the same time, "I must admit that, faced with Fassbender's almost sublime desperation, faced with his lucid and unshakable madness, and faced with your own, so intense and viscerally real, experience in the White Room with your little Lucy, for the first time since I have devoted myself with passion and rigor to this singular profession, that fundamental pillar of my conception of the world has, for a moment, dangerously wavered. I have seen with my eyes, or rather, I have perceived with a sense deeper than simple observation, how pain and desire can bend the most iron logic, how the human mind, under the pressure of unbearable suffering, can create alternative realities, interior worlds, with a force and vividness that defy almost any purely rational analysis. The dose of which good Paracelsus spoke, my dear friend, applies not only to the chemical substances we ingest or inhale, but also, and perhaps with even more powerful and lasting effects, to the emotions that consume us, to the hopes we desperately cling to the illusions our own mind produces to protect us from a truth too cruel to bear. He returned to sit, taking up his now almost extinguished pipe. Fassbender, in his tragic illusion, offered his so-called patients a sweet poison, a drug for the soul that temporarily soothed their pain only to make reality, at the moment of abrupt awakening, even more bitter and desolate, and the wound of mourning even deeper and infected. There are mysteries, Watson, that science and logic can unveil with surgical precision, mechanisms that can be dismantled piece by piece, culprits who can and must be brought to justice. But there are also unfathomable abysses in the human soul, pains so rooted and needs so desperate that no investigation, however brilliant and meticulous, can truly and completely resolve or heal. He paused, and a rare smile, veiled with deep and almost palpable melancholy, creased his thin lips. In those cases, my dear and faithful friend, he concluded, with a voice that was little more than a whisper, perhaps the detective's task collides inexorably with the insurmountable limits of his art, and nothing remains but to rely on that simple, but often so incredibly difficult to practice, virtue that is human understanding. And sometimes, as in your case, Watson, on a promise of sincere affection kept with a young and innocent soul lost and in need of light. We remained silent for another long moment, each lost in our own reflections, while the evening shadows lengthened in the room. Then, as I instinctively prepared to take my notebook and pen to begin fixing on paper what promised to be one of my most singular and complex chronicles, Holmes stopped me with an almost imperceptible gesture of his hand. "One last thing, Watson," he said, and his tone had returned to the more practical and admonishing one I knew well, though there was still a trace of that previous, unusual gravity. "Regarding this entire, and in many ways deplorable, affair, I would ask you for once, and with the utmost seriousness, to exercise the most absolute discretion in your praiseworthy and often very useful activity as chronicler of my modest successes." He looked at me fixedly, and in his eyes flashed a gleam of severe admonishment. "If news were to spread through London, and from there throughout the empire, that every honest English citizen, every afflicted widow, every parent in mourning, has potential access to a powerful and uncontrollable hallucinogen that grows spontaneously and abundantly in public gardens, uncultivated lands, even at the margins of our most frequented streets, since stramonium, as you know, is a weed and incredibly resistant plant, I fear we would soon have an epidemic of uncontrolled spirit visions, of accidental or, worse, intentional intoxications, far more vast and socially devastating than that, however limited, orchestrated by poor, mad Professor Fassbender. Some, in their naivety or desperation, would smoke even nettle or poison ivy leaves just to feel a thrill or seek impossible comfort. Others would die miserably poisoned trying to meet beloved deceased Aunt Philomena or the lost canary. No, Watson, certain secrets of nature and certain weaknesses inherent in human nature are much better left confined to the austere pages of botany and toxicology manuals, or in cold courtrooms, and never given as fodder to the morbid curiosity or desperate credulity of the general public. And with that final warning, which concealed a deep, though cynical, understanding of human frailties and one last, unexpected flash of his old pragmatic spirit, Sherlock Holmes closed his eyes, resting his head on the cushion of his armchair. Perhaps, for once, he was abandoning himself not to the iron and reassuring logic of Laplace, but to the unfathomable and sometimes disturbing mystery of sleep and dreams, where even London's sharpest mind could find, if not answers, at least a temporary and perhaps necessary oblivion. The end. Curator's note. This tale, though never published during Dr. Watson's lifetime, was found among his private papers after his death. His request not to divulge it was respected for almost a century, until advances in modern science made the information contained within less dangerous. However, the utmost caution is still recommended in the use of any botanical substance mentioned in the text. You have listened to the third part of the case of the March Hedgehog, an unpublished Sherlock Holmes tale, a Pseudobiblia narration. We hope you enjoyed this journey. The next novel will be published on July 18, 2025. Remember to like the video and subscribe for a new audiobook every Friday and explore our playlists for other genres. Thank you for listening. This work is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and events are products of the author's imagination or used fictitiously. Any reference to real people, events, or places existing or having existed is purely coincidental.